All right, guys, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present today at the Grand Rounds talk for you guys. So the actual talk itself is regarding ultimately physician compensation. And that itself is a hot and sometimes almost taboo topic, especially in the field of neurosurgery. Globally, where our scales of pay are higher than those of our colleagues in general, and especially in residency, where discussion of education is secondary to the discussion and education of compensation, because we're essentially clinical learners first. However, there's an absolute paucity in how much information residents actually know about the finances and the business of neurosurgery, let alone the business of medicine in general. So the ramifications of that are hard for someone like me to discuss. I'm a junior resident, very far away from the actual academic and private job market. So today I thought it'd be interesting to dive into the history, the theory, and the practice of compensation and value. Ultimately, neurosurgeons, either in training or beyond, carry a significant intrinsic value. And so if anything at all, I intend to remind you of that. So to start, though, let's do a little exercise that does require some basic participation. This is a mildly misleading slide. I guess I do have some level of conflict of interest in this because there's a financial incentive for me to understand this too. But as of right now, I don't get paid for this. So this is what I want you guys to do. If you guys wouldn't mind, please going to this actual website. There's a little kink in it. So if you just type in pollev, POLLEV.com, what you should get is a black screen that'll ask you to join. And then where it says the username, you can type in where it says Sumed Shah 030. And so once you do that, you should come to a screen like this. And so once you guys are ready, I will activate it. And you guys should now see a survey. And so the way the survey questions work is that you're given a question, and based on whether or not you're an attending or resident fellow, if you're a fellow, you can place yourself in whichever category you feel like you want. But essentially the question is, do you know the answer to the question? You don't necessarily have to answer the question itself as an exact, but do you even know what the question is asking essentially? So if you're intending, it'll either say yes or no. If you're a resident, it'll either say yes or no. So if you guys wouldn't mind answering those questions, and then there's 5 total questions.
A fellow is like an instructor.
As attending, so the fellows, and if you wouldn't mind being in the attending group. How do you object to the question? Is intending. Fellow answers attending. And so essentially what you should do, I'll go back really quickly, type in this pollev.com into your website browser, and then my name, Sumed Shah 030 as the username, and then a survey will pop up. So while the results of that survey are being essentially tallied, and while you guys are still going, we can continue. The first aspect of this talk, though, you have to fundamentally understand and establish is why do and why should you care? This is not as easy as resident make no money, attending make money, so you should learn. It's essentially, I would argue that this is an important basic knowledge everyone should have an understanding of for the following reasons. 1, changes in physician compensation is intertwined in a lot more than how hard you work, how many hours of surgery you do, how many patients you see. Medical markets change, and global financial situations play heavily into how much essentially you actually get compensated for. So if you look at a graph like this is sourced from the US News and World Report. Physician compensation looks like it's increasing nicely year to year. Obviously, any source data you choose will have different actual numbers associated. However, it's interesting to note that these types of graphs and numbers cannot adequately capture the external forces that influence what these numbers actually mean. And so, for example, the rates of inflation in the last 10 years have been increasing, and events that change every facet of life in medicine, such as this little one denoted by an arrow, can bring in a significant amount of volatility and variation to US and world market economics. That ultimately will affect any and every profession, including us. So obviously that arrow represented COVID. So if you consider that inflation rates are significantly higher, then the actual value of the money you make has been going down or stagnant, if not actually up. So if you take each of those numbers and calculate what that actual dollar strength is currently, the number and the graphs look very different. In 2010, you roughly made, the physicians across the board, not just neurosurgeons, made roughly $180,000 on average, according to this data set. However, that had the buying power back then of what $217,000 has today. Obviously, the numbers will change depending on whatever source data you use. But the point I'm trying to make is that globally, the physician pay is not necessarily increasing linearly. So yeah, you should probably know how you get paid. Next, the system of payments are changing dramatically itself and will continue to do so. So understanding the basics now allow you to navigate changes in the system and then also anticipate them. Billing charges and billing changes are always on the horizon. And the healthcare sector is greatly studied for this reason, especially in the financial world, And firms like Deloitte survey and publish data on this, and particularly on physician compensation. So this phrase is actually from the Deloitte website. I've highlighted a little phrase here, value-based care. And you must be thinking, isn't that how we get paid, right? The service I provide is valuable and we do a lot of good work, right? But I'm sure it is, and I know it will be. Currently, the system we use is a fee-for-service model, and that is what is prominently used. So then what is value-based care? Simply put, it's the attempt to incentivize and pay physicians and hospitals based on the quality of the care provided, not just a service of that care that's provided. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has already started to implement these programs. For example, through the Hospital Acquired Conditions Reduction Program, payment for services rendered may be lower than before, particularly if your hospital or group experiences higher than average hospital acquired conditions, stuff like postoperative hematomas, wound dehiscences, etc. This is actually one of the reasons why on the order sets that we all have to do, there's an order set part of it that says and asks us to document what the pre-hospital conditions are. These include things like UTIs. They include things like pressure ulcers, because those are actually dings against our hospital if it happens within the hospital itself. And your actual payment for services rendered at the hospital can be lower if it's a hospital acquired thing. So yeah, sounds like a globally good idea, value-based care then. So how prominent then is the fee-for-service model that we use currently? It's actually very, very prominent. So that same study suggests that 97% of physicians who responded to that survey indicate that fee-for-service or salary is how they get paid. So chances are that changes to physician pay, as they become more tangible, we're all going to feel the effects of that. So understanding it now, understanding how physicians get paid becomes a little bit more important. Next, if you don't know what you're doing, you could make a mistake. Right? And while losing out on some money is irksome, it's definitely not as mentally taxing as finding yourself in legal trouble. It can actually be illegal to make mistakes on Medicare healthcare billing. So Medicare fraud costs billions of dollars annually. So this is going to be a relatively and heavily regulated topic. This is something I thought was very interesting. In the survey from the Canadian Journal of Surgery, surveyors asked a group of residents and then staff physicians, i.e. attendings, to respond to a 10-question scenario-based billing assessment. Essentially, they asked questions regarding billing scenarios, and you as a resident or you as an attending had to ask or had to answer what code should be used, how this should be billed, etc. And interestingly, as we expect, the residents did not do great. We're not very good at billing stuff. But interestingly as well, beyond that, attending similarly did not necessarily answer these questions correctly. And in fact, both groups averaged 2 incorrect billing codes per question. And then when you ask residents, is this something that should be taught in residency? The answer to that question resoundingly was either important or very important to resident cohort, but almost a third of attendings at this survey felt like it was not important. And it makes sense. Clinical education is critical. Yes, Dr. Shah. Yeah, I think globally the billing for them, the concept I think is still the same, right? Understanding how the billing process works, whether or not it's like a socialized system versus somewhere here. I'm sure if you do the results on something like this, and part of the next part of this actual talk is for me to show you what the results of this exact, well, not this exact, but a similar study here was. This is part of the reason there's actually an interactive poll in this presentation. So I'm curious to see what the results of that are going to be. I don't know. I actually haven't looked at the data yet because it was just done. But
Yeah, just
Yeah.
you know, to add
Mhm.
the Canadian question, at least with neurosurgery, just about every center, academic center is a salary model.
Mhm.
As opposed to, compensation
Model.
Yeah, so you would think,
Mhm.
and I think that's why she was asking that question, that it would be in general in Canada relatively less important.
Yeah.
As opposed to the US.
So then, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And then for that standpoint, I would imagine then the numbers might actually be very different if you were to do that here. In fact, suggesting that it probably is more important for residents to understand it here as opposed to it is in other places.
So Dr. Lenny, our physician removed from the process of submitting a charge. For procedures.
It was back in my day, I don't know if, yeah, is it still that way in Canada? Like, back when I was a resident, there was didn't deal with any billing issues as a.
The only time, which you I think would want a sticker, so they can bill with the consult, but that's very rare at the academic sites where it's all on salary, then the shadow bill, and then at the other sites where it's on salary, there's actually a book that you can look up, and it's a single level, you see, yeah, have a price code and training audit for an extra absolute price, and have a code attached to it, but no, you don't get a return on your RP, that's just what the bill covered, and not including what the bill that the 70 for service. So the data is captured and just compensation.
Right, administrators capture it, it's, yeah.
It's for negotiation purposes, so that not increase their salaries.
All right, I'm actually on call as well, so I'll get that later. So then if you were to ask the next question of how much missed revenue, improper billing costs, the answers are interesting. Almost a third of people who at this institution felt that lost billings were significant. Greater than 10% of all possible billable charges were lost. So educating the next generation now theoretically has a financial toll. And don't forget that even a mistake can look like fraud to the US government. And the price for Medicare fraud, I'm just kidding, I'm not going to read that. If the prospect of reading that block of text seems overwhelming, then being accused of Medicare fraud is probably not for you. So punishments include things like prison time, heavy fines, banning from federal payment programs, just to name a few. So a little aggressive maybe, but the point is that you need to know what to bill for to maximize how much your return is without overdoing it.
Can you give us an example?
We're going to give an example. Absolutely. Yeah. On a procedure we do commonly here, and then what the actual RVU base for Medicare is. So the bottom line, while I could go on and on, why it's important to understand the billing, the RVU, and overall what this talk ultimately represents, the most important part in my mind is the following. It's the bottom line. Understanding the finances helps you understand your intrinsic value to the hospital, program, and beyond. So based off of that now, I'm curious what this is going to show. So this right here is the actual.
While your survey's thinking, I just can't help but comment on your last statement.
Yeah.
But is that really our intrinsic value? You're gonna answer that question.
I'm going to answer that question.
That's the tip.
Exactly. We're not just billing machines. Our intrinsic value is greater than that. So what does an RVU stand for? Most attendings said yes. So of the survey, it sounds like all the attendings who answered, including the fellow instructors, said yes. There's a portion of residents that didn't know what an RVU stood for. So hopefully this talks and answer that. Do you know how total RVUs are calculated? I'd say, yeah, a little bit less than half of the attendings said yes. Most residents said no. They did not know what a total RVU, how that was calculated. How do you convert an RVU into a dollar compensation? Some attendings knew, some attendings didn't, and fellows. Some residents did, a lot of residents did not. Do you know what the current conversion factor is for Medicare? So yes and no, and then globally residents seemingly said no. And this is just something interesting. Do you know how many RVUs a shunt reprogramming can make you? Most people do not, but don't worry, we're going to actually talk about that as an example. So I asked a group of 6 residents how many shunt reprogramming they did in the month of November, and these are the breakdowns, and these are the actual payment schedule for Nicholas Children's Hospital in 2018. This is the data that I had. I asked the office manager to give me the form. Now, obviously, $201 for a single shunt reprogram is not probably what you're going to get paid for shunt reprogramming. And also resident number 6, you have to step it up because, yeah, that's a lot of, that's not a lot. So the actual number, I'm sorry, I didn't actually calculate to 9, it was 10. So in the month of November, $2,010 worth of theoretical shunt reprogrammings were done. And so that's an interesting number, right? Now you have a number as to when you're called in the middle of the night to reprogram a shunt. This is actually billable information to the hospital. And what does that equate to over rotation, over a year, and over a full residency?
So those are charges, not collections.
Those are not charges, those are correct. So the actual amount of money that you'd get for a shunt reprogram is less than this, probably significantly less than this. The actual RVU base for, yeah. In general, in a hospital setting, probably less than half, most likely. I don't know how it is. 30%. Yeah. Yeah. That's private insurance. Yeah.
75 or 80% of pediatric care is about 13%.
Yeah.
What's this 30% discount?
If a patient doesn't have insurance, that's cash payment.
Put any number you want to there. Where's the RVU number?
2. Yeah. So the RVU for a single shunt reprogram for Medicare is 2.4 RVUs for a reprogramming of shunt. It's 0.7 for the work RVU. It's 1.4 for the facility fee, and it's 0.2 for the malpractice insurance, because you can malpractice shunt reprogramming, I guess. So then, interesting. This. That'll be the discussion in the next talk, I promise. But yeah, so at the University of Tennessee, a personal log kept by single junior residents, junior neurosurgical resident over a 2-year period was used to obtain the total number of consultations, admissions, procedures, CPT codes, and they were used to estimate what that resident's on-call economic value was for that 2-year period. And annually, it was actually $350,000. So almost $700,000 over the course of 2 years could be directly linked to a single resident on call. And what does that mean for a cohort of 16 residents at this institution? $1.7 million, or roughly 20,000 RVUs. So yeah, residents have an economic value that's intrinsic, but not just the obvious value that you can bring with a dollar sign, the educational value as well. Yeah. This talk was meant to rustle some feathers, Dr. Levy. It really was. Correct. Yeah. So in fact, the resident benefit, we call it Medicare pays for resident, essentially resident education. And so if you look at, for example, University of Michigan, something similar, the net value of a single resident across all specialties, including surgical and non-surgical subspecialties, is a positive $200,000.
How much?
Oh, that I'm here to rustle feathers, not cook the chicken. So
there's the administrator, you'll hear this like it's GME offices.
Yeah.
The residents are lost in money and there's a lot of overhead costs.
Yeah.
Residents, so you have, the administrator pay for like the creative program coordinator salary.
Sure.
You have to pay for your stipend and so there's a lot of like extra costs that end up being like, your salary may be like $50,000, but they go up like 150 when they like play all this,
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
charge Medicare,
Yeah.
somewhere like around 100, a little bit less than that. So there's actually a good podcast that you might work with.
Yeah.
New Mexico.
Yeah.
Program. How are you gonna go over that?
Well, I mean, I know when New Mexico lost its neurosurgery residency program, that was 8 residents that they had to essentially let go or find other programs. But that's still neurosurgical practice that needed a workforce. And so 23 nurse practitioners were hired. So for a single resident, you have to hire essentially 3 nurse practitioners. But that's just based off of what the podcast suggested, not what I'm suggesting. So now that I've garnered some interest in this topic and your coffee has started to kick in, what better way to lead this conversation than to the very beginning, the history behind the genesis of the current RVU system. So we'll talk about how an RVU is calculated. We'll talk about who determines how much our efforts are actually relatively worth and what the process of billing actually looks like. And finally, we'll end this rather broad discussion on what value-based care charges are going to be taking neurosurgery. And while it's not an all-encompassing talk, the premise of the actual conversation is to garner some interest and some background information. So the history of the current model of reimbursement essentially straddles two major US acts that centralize medical billing in the United States: the Social Security's Amendments of 1965 and the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 89. I'm not going to go into the actual acts themselves, but they do demarcate some interesting time zones. So buckle up, and any good story begins in the beginning. Do you guys know what that is? Ooh, that is correct. I actually didn't think anyone was going to get that. So this is the Code of Hammurabi. And so the first recorded interface of the medical profession, law, and billing of services was actually through Hammurabi's code. So what you may not know is that of the 282 laws that Hammurabi placed on a tablet, 9 of them revolve around the medical practice, billing, and malpractice. So for example, law 215, if a physician performs eye surgery and saves the eye, he shall receive 10 shekel in money. I don't know what the conversion rate for a shekel to US dollars is currently, but I imagine it could be pretty high. So a fee for service model seems based in antiquity, though interestingly, incentives for maintaining good outcomes was also important. So law 218, if you killed someone, your hands are going to get cut off. So there is, in fact, in other words, value-based healthcare at an extreme was practiced at that time as well. However, it wasn't until the Social Security's Amendment of 65, the legislature that actually created Medicare and Medicaid, that we really see the dominoes arrange towards what the current system is. And so, important period of time, the one I called the antebellum period, saw the rise of the RVU until its implementation officially in 89 through the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. As an interesting aside, something I learned was that the American Medical Association actually copyrights each edition of the CPT code and charges a licensing fee for it. So if you want to return to your phones, there's a next question is how much do you think the American Medical Association makes on CPT code generation? Essentially, to use a CPT code, you have to pay a licensing fee to the American Medical Association. And that could range, I actually tried to look it up, that license for a single practitioner could range anywhere from $17 to $300. For whatever reason, it's not something that's very easily found. And then the number that I'm about to share with you, how much money the AMA can make out of this, I only have the figure for 2009 because I couldn't find it any recent number. So you can imagine the number is probably higher. So there's a little survey that I sent out as well, but you can also shout it out. You don't have to go back to the. If you really want it, it's the Pollev, Pollev, and then you would type in my name, Sumed Shah 030, and then you'd get the poll. It's a fill in the blank. See how accurate you guys are. 1.1 million, someone said. 20 million, someone said. It's a lot of money. 2 billion. This talk is definitely for you. Too much. That's correct. 3 million. We're getting there. $700 billion. A lot of money. Yeah, so you guys are right. Besides her, it says $700 billion or 500. Yeah, $500 million is actually not a bad guess, actually. So it's roughly 1/4 of the entire American Medical Association revenue. So 1 in every $4 is from asking people to use the CPT code. But then you use the CPT code in order to bill. Very interesting, right? So it's actually roughly $71 million in 2009. So that's a lot of money, a quarter of the revenue of the American Medical Association just to be able to bill. And they copyright it every year. So CPT code is by definition the property of the American Medical Association. Something that I did not know, something I thought was very interesting to find out. So that was the question. So American Medical Association created the CPT code the year after Medicare was created. So the answer is $71 million, roughly 25% of the total RVU, or the revenue that the AMA makes in a year. But moving on, the important bill to recognize is Social Security's Amendment of 65, and that included the creation of government payer healthcare Medicare. And it would actually interest you to know that a huge opponent against Medicare was actually the American Medical Association itself. And so this man, Wilbur Cohen, one of the architects, included verbiage as to how physicians would be compensated through Medicare. These usual, customary, and responsible charges, or UCRs, would be how physicians made their money. Early dissenters of a system like this complained that it was just a way for doctors to charge whatever they wanted. Some actually even said that this was introduced into the bill to placate the American Medical Association. There's actually in a book by Atul Gawande, it's actually directly in there, that this was created to placate the American Medical Association. So from 65 to 85, being a physician, especially in a surgical subspecialty, was lucrative. But as all good things start, they all must come to an end. So the costs associated with certain procedures did not keep up and keep in touch with the technologies utilized to make those procedures safer and faster. For example, in the 60s, a surgery, let's say a cataract surgery, could take hours. But as time went on, in the 80s, perhaps, that same procedure would only take a fraction of the time. The pay, though, exact same, despite how short or how long that surgery took. In 1985, just the cataract surgery alone accounted for 4% of the entire Medicare budget. This, our governmental overlords thought, was unacceptable. $3.5 billion in cataract surgery alone. This is actually a news article from 1985 in the South Florida Sun Sentinel. The national taxpayers will fork out $3.5 billion this year in Medicaid payments for cataract surgery. So Hammurabi had a fixation on ocular conditions, and perhaps he knew something we didn't know about how important it was for medical legal politics. So as the government does when it's in a bind, is it sends in a fixer. And meet the fixer. This is Dr. William Shao, a Harvard economist and healthcare specialist tasked with creating a better system for paying physicians. And Dr. Shao and his team over the course of years interviewed dozens, if not hundreds or scores of physicians across specialties regarding exactly what procedures, what medical tasks, etc. that they did, and realized that the time, effort, energy, resource expenditure, cost of malpractice could all be used to compare the work of one doctor in one specialty to the work of another doctor in another specialty, and even within that same specialty. The relative value of a service, he thought, was a combination of a physician's work, how much the practice expense was, and the professional's liability in incurring that practice. In other words, he, Dr. Shao, created the RVU. This is controversial, as expected. Procedural-based practices took a substantial hit. This is actually a figure from one of the landmark papers that was published in '88 in the New England Journal of Medicine. When comparing all these CPT codes and understanding the work that went behind the procedures and training of the doctors and covering the liability insurance and all that, he came to propose that procedural specialists were being overpaid. Remember how cataract surgeries cost an arm and a leg to the US government? Well, thanks to the RVU, when you compare the relative value performing cataract surgery, the cost expenditure drops nearly 60%. And that's, the adage goes what? A penny saved is a penny earned. Just in that 1 year transition, imagine how many pennies would be saved with $898 per procedure. These figures, like I said, came from that landmark set of papers that were published in the JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine. And this is just ophthalmology. That's what was highlighted in red. If you look up even higher, there's cardiothoracic surgery bypass with 4 coronary grafts. $4,000 becomes $1,300. Almost a 70% hit.
Everything went down. Did anything go up?
There's one thing that went up. I'm so glad you asked. Evaluation and management, essentially, diagnostic medicine as in primary care medicine, internal medicine, non-procedural based medicines took an increase in almost 56% globally across all CPT codes that they looked at. Whereas invasive procedures, surgery, almost half, laboratory down 5%, and imaging down 30%. So yeah, this saves money, but at the expense of invasive medical care. Dr. Shou was a Harvard economist PhD. He was not a physician. Yep. So in 89, now that this strategy had become widespread, it had finally adopted in 92. And that was actually done by George H.W. Bush, excuse me. Of course, Harvard economists cannot tell us what our value and individual practice values are and procedures and the value they have, right? So to exert some influence over this process, the American Medical Association created a committee, which we will soon talk about, that essentially determines what an RVU is and how much to pay an RVU. But despite these relatively recent changes to creating the RVU system, Harvard economists still continue to influence medical compensation politics. Michael Porter, for example, another Harvard economist, brought in the concept of the value-based healthcare compensation, and we're going to go somewhat into that. But Medicare has already begun to implement some of these services. This is the actual quote from the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act that Bush signed in '89. The determinations of Medicare payments for physician services pursuant to a fee schedule takes into account the relative value of the work, practice expenses, and the malpractice risks associated with each physician service. So yeah, the RVU became essentially law. For the sake of time and sanity, I'm not going to go over the details, but you can see how these programs in the bottom row and the actual bills in the top row, when they started being implemented. So there's a bunch of acronyms and such. Essentially, what I want you to take away from this is that value-based programs have begun being implemented through Medicare since 2012. Things like, for example, to name a few, hospital readmission reduction program, i.e. if your hospital has greater than average readmissions, your overall compensation will drop. If your hospital has higher than average post-operative any medical complication post-operative or such, your compensation will drop. Essentially, the idea is to value the quality of the care, not just the quantity of the care. But that itself is a global, another topic. So the hospital's compensation. Hospital's compensation.
What percentage are we talking about?
The percentage, for example, one of the global payment package, for example, is used as an example where a hospital will get paid a package of money to include all medical costs essentially for 90 days. And so, for example, that upfront package can drop if you have, it can be like anywhere from like 2 to 5%.
That's low. It's like
Yeah.
1%. That's
Yeah.
still a lot.
It can be, yeah, it can be a significant amount. Yeah. But you know, and I would say that while exactly being a small amount of theoretical money for a single experience, now imagine an entire hospital gets docked 2% every single time a patient comes in through that global payment program. Essentially, you come into the hospital, you get a package of money, and then whatever services are rendered during that hospitalization, pay and stay, come from that packet of money. So the automatic money you start with can be smaller if you have, for example, any hit to a value-based program practice.
But those things implemented under the Obama administration were set to take place in tiered and incremental ways. Where at first there was an incentive to do it, and then a period where it became a punishment.
Yeah.
Where it's
Yeah.
1 or 2% decline, and ultimately it was going to double every couple of years. But that has been held off on an annual basis through this reconciliation that goes on at the end where there's all this bartering. So they
Yeah.
have not done that, and that's the thing you see every year in the paper where they're fighting about how much money is going to go back in to fund the gap. So that has yet to take place. It's a small number now, but if it hadn't been stopped every year, it would be a lot more money.
A lot more money.
The broken system.
So how is a total RVU calculated? And this is the fun part, right? So this is a formula. Formulas suck. But the total RVU, as we know, is a calculation of the work a physician does, i.e. the work RVU, how added to the practice expense, added to the malpractice costs. So the work RVU is pretty straightforward. It's the provider work when providing a service. It counts things like technical skill, physical, mental effort, judgment, stress, the amount of time that it takes to do a procedure. For example, a procedure that would take 5 minutes would probably be compensated less than a procedure that takes 5 hours, right? Obvious. Practice expense reflects the cost of clinical and non-clinical labor and expenses of the practice. For example, a facility like a hospital would theoretically cost a physician less to do that procedure in that hospital than if that doctor would do that same procedure in their office. So there are separation codes that would change the RVU base if a procedure is done in a facility or a non-facility, i.e. a doctor's office. And finally, the malpractice RVU, the cost of professional liability insurance based off of the relative risk associated with each CPT code. Neurosurgery, there's a lot of difficult pathologies treated. So the RVU for malpractice would theoretically be higher in that case. And we'll actually talk about something even more interesting, which I found was the geographic practice cost index. Essentially, what that is that where you are in the United States determines a modifier on how many RVUs you will get to perform like a service in that place. For example, a physician in Anchorage is going to pay twice as much as a non-clinical staff in Oklahoma City. So essentially, if you're going to be the cost of your practice is higher in San Francisco versus middle of nowhere. If the cost of essentially paying someone and all these things, these are all costs that are associated. And you can find each of these. Miami's modifiers, for example, we'll go over.
That makes total sense.
It does. Yeah.
You're gonna talk about the what?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes, sir. Oh, yes. We're getting there, I promise. So look, this is the conversion factor. This is the Medicare conversion factor. Essentially, one RVU has $1 assigned to it. And this is the Medicare value. So other institutions can use their own RVU-based systems for compensation, meaning one RVU gets this many dollars. This is the Medicare one. This is available on their website. And the current Medicare compensation for a single RVU is actually $34.62 in 2022. So less than it was in 2020, less than it was in 2019, etc. So how much you get for an RVU can also change year to year. And this is just for a single physician doing a service. For example, something like an anesthesiologist will have their own CPT codes and their own billing practices. So that's a separate cost in its entirety. So here's a real life example using the CPT code 61510 or the resection of a brain tumor. This is literally all from the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid's database. So there's no question. This is the legitimate numbers. You can actually look it up. You can just type in a code and they'll pop these numbers out. But for simplicity's sake, I basically just broke it down like this. The work RVU associated, roughly 31 RVUs to remove a brain tumor. The physician, or rather the practice expense, it's a costly endeavor for a practice to remove a brain tumor. So 23 RVUs. And finally, the malpractice RVU base, 11. But when you add in the geographic modifiers, doing a brain tumor resection in Miami is not theoretically any different than doing a brain tumor resection in San Francisco or in Oklahoma or wherever. The amount of physician, or rather the practice expense, similar relatively. It's slightly higher, the cost in Miami for just global things. So the modifier is slightly higher. But interestingly, the Miami, South Florida is a highly litigious place. So the modifier for something like malpractice insurance is almost 3 times. So that's something where if you do a neurosurgical endeavor and remove a brain tumor in Miami versus you do in the other else in the state of Florida, you'll actually get more RVUs for having done it in Miami versus having done it somewhere else.
Man, are you going to comment on the fact that almost all calculations like the young people is not based on this stuff?
A lot of it.
On the work part.
The work RVU. And so
Calculations are relevant for almost everybody.
Right. So a lot of the contracts you're going to get seen, and this is something part of the beginning of the talk was a lot of this information I'm providing is just the musings of a single junior resident, far from actually signing their own contract, right? And so the work RVU base, that's I think something you should take more into consideration for. But something like, for example, a shunt reprogram has an RVU base to it. So just not something to base your medical practice off of, but something to keep in mind, right? So anyways, the RVU, the amount of RVUs themselves per procedure is something that is subject to continuous change. And that's something that we're going to discuss with the RUC, the update committee. And so, for example, if you were to take that total RVU, not work RVU specifically, you're looking at roughly $3,000 for a hospital to remove a brain tumor. So who determines what an RVU is, and who determines why someone like a brain surgeon deserves more or less RVUs than a cardiothoracic surgeon when they're doing a bypass? The RUC does, the RUC, if you will, or the Relative Value Update Committee. This is a group of 32 physicians, 22 of whom are appointed with each major national medical society, and they make recommendations multiple times a year on a number of different codes themselves. This is actually very conceptually difficult for me to necessarily understand. A single neurosurgeon sits on this committee. This is actually our guy, Dr. Vates from University of Rochester. So he's according to the American Medical Association. It's actually, if you look at the AANS website, it's a different name, but this is the American Medical Association website. But this gentleman essentially sits on that committee and discusses the RVU that a neurosurgeon can produce on a whole number of surgeries that neurosurgeons do, and discuss them with cardiothoracic surgeon, orthopedic surgeon, essentially other surgeons, other doctors across all other specialties in this RUC update committee, and determines what the relative value of removing a brain tumor is in comparison to the relative value of doing something else. So if you look at the AMA website, this is Dr. Vates, our guy. I think if you look at the AANS website, it's a gentleman from Stanford that's on the RUC, but I just use what was on the AMA.
What's his subspecialty?
So his subspecialty, I believe, is peripheral. His is brain tumor skull base.
On this website,
Yeah.
it says Dr. Bates has performed surgery in over 120 patients. That's not impressive.
My goodness. Yeah.
How does he end up on that? To the AMA.
This is the AMA.
I understand, so but still, how does it, remember the AMA, but how does this guy end up being?
So he's appointed by the American Association of Neurological Surgeons.
Nothing to do with surgery or anything. He's part of the AMA.
He's appointed by the American Association of Neurosurgeons. So he himself is a gentleman on the committee that does so.
But we have outside representation.
Mhm.
We're 1% of doctors. We have 2 seats in AMA House Delegate.
Mhm.
That's why we get paid so much.
Yeah.
That's why people should go to meetings,
Mhm.
society dues, Dr. Radcliffe, please. DNS, because we only have
Yeah.
4 representative seats, DNS, the AANS, NAS, and ISAC.
Mhm.
Those are the societies that represent an AMA House Delegate.
Which is, and part of the point of even bringing the slide up is that it's very important for us as neurosurgeons and for us as just physicians in general to sit there and be part of these committees, because our physician compensation is directly related to how these people discuss these things.
Recently, we all got emails about how important it is to be a member.
Yeah.
Because if you're not a member of the AMA, because what you just said, like, is that, our representation actually comes to us going to the meetings and dues in our own societies, but we're not members of the AMA.
ISAC, which makes up 25% of all the power we have and how we get paid, almost lost their AMA House Delegate. Because not enough of a percentage of members of ISAC wanted to pay their AMA dues to $1,000 a year.
Right.
So every doctor in here says, I don't want to pay my dues, too much money. And guess what? In 10 years, you're making as much as a pediatrician. That's the end result of this. You've got to take your security. It's a zero-sum game. So you've got to battle every other specialty, generalist in the world for a limited pod. It's only so big, right?
Yeah. So the process of billing, very similar. We're almost coming towards the end, so I'll just basically go. These are the parts I'll talk about just really shortly. A service is rendered and documented. The attending bills a code. For example, whenever you place an H&P and at UM, you kind of get this pop-up that'll come up. Medical coding staff can query the billable chart for billable services, and a claim is filed and submitted. Generally, we don't have very much to do with this part. Either in your practice, you have someone who does the billing for you, or the institution that you work for does the billing on your behalf based off of the codes you provide and based off the services you've rendered. That claim is approved or denied, and the portion of the bill is paid. This is actually the CMS 1500, which is the Medicare form that you would use to submit to Medicare itself. And finally, whatever is paid, whatever you felt like is the patient's responsibility becomes their responsibility as balance billing.
How important is it for delegates actual personality that can as, I mean.
We've got to serve organized neurosurgery for years and years, develop competence, understand every code, its origin. I mean, Joe Chang lectured to us, Dr. Joe Chang, came and he gave us a lecture about how this sausage is made. So if somebody's willing to, every society will be willing to take your volunteer work for a couple thousand hours of your time, get competence. And once you do that, we'd be happy to appoint you. Well, nobody will volunteer 1,000 hours, right? Of the first time. So people like Dr. Bates, as much as he criticized him, he actually spent the time to develop confidence while you were getting out, right? So that was on.
So more important than the billing process, I think, is understanding why claims get rejected. And so most common cause rejections happen on the front end of the claims process itself. This is actually data from a group called Change Healthcare that essentially does this research. They determine what gets denied, what doesn't get denied, and why. And so if you do not check your patient's eligibility, for example, i.e. does your patient's insurance contract with your hospital or your group or whatever, that accounts for 26% of claim rejections upfront. But that's actually not entirely the important part as well. Missing or invalid data, medical documentation, untimely filing, medical coding, these are all things that if you were to calculate all of that, come out to 36%. 36% of the reasons why things get rejected are theoretically things that you shouldn't be making mistakes on. So that's an interesting concept, right? So understanding this process now, again, carries a financial interesting burden. So what does value-based care mean in neurosurgery? And this is something that's a very nuanced topic, and we're coming towards the very end of it. Ultimately, who determines value and what like a valuable outcome in neurosurgery? A lot of these diseases we treat are highly destructive. They're highly damaging, and they're things that ultimately need to be addressed regardless. So many of those, are those going to be patient-based metrics? Does that mean that someone who, for example, and if that's the case, is it entirely fair to base a physician's compensation on something like a patient outcome metric or something like that? Some people may say yes, but the cranial patient who never washed their hair and gets a wound infection, is that entirely fair that that's something that gets docked on a physician? Or is something a spine patient that refuses to wear their LSO after surgery and then has worsened pain? Is that something that ultimately is a patient outcome metric that we induced? And if that's something that's the case, we get compensated for that. So a lot of these things I think are very important to pay attention to. Is how you get compensated is going to be coming down to how sometimes patients feel about their surgery. But that's part of the global topic. So resource-based allocation is going to be based on how much healthcare cost you spend. So something like something as simple as does a microvascular decompression, you go to the ICU afterwards. People have done research on this, found that theoretically it can be safe to do. And if you can drop the healthcare costs globally, does that mean that your value-based care, i.e. the cost of the service you provide and the quality of the outcome, is that a metric that's going to be used? Reducing healthcare cost. And if you actually look up the utility of using ICU admissions for post-operative routine elective craniotomies, there are some people who suggest that if everything goes perfectly, don't put them in the ICU. Obviously, we have institutional bias here that I think is safe and appropriate, but that's something to consider. The cost of healthcare is something, and how to minimize and cost mitigate is something that we may be asked to look into and do. Patient-reported outcome measures as critical tools to document quality of care. And again, we kind of discussed a little bit of this. Evidence-based medical decision-making. For example, the North American Skull-Based Society in 2020 introduced a workforce, a task force, looking at value-based healthcare, its research, outcome metrics, and education for its members. So this is something that's coming. How it's coming and why and how to be on top of that and in front of it is important to ultimately be on that conversation, particularly as you're a neurosurgeon going into your careers. So the summary of this, we're coming towards the end. And I want to leave some time for questions. Understanding finance is important. Understanding the process for how an RVU is handled at the committee level, at your hospital level, at your own personal practice level is critical because your compensation is something that is determined by these things. Changes to medical compensation are coming and fields will be equally subject to the effects of value-based care. And they're going to manifest itself as greater focus, in my opinion, on things like patient-reported outcomes and cost cost containment strategies. But globally, more research and time is going to tell how we're going to adapt to this. But it's important as a conversation, as a topic, to understand upfront how an RVU is based, how do you calculate it, what your conversion factor is going to be. These are kind of important things that no one talks about, to us about. Because ultimately, and rightfully, our job and our goal in this process is to learn how to do neurosurgery safely and to be a patient advocate, not necessarily how to bill. This is an important part of it in the back of your mind that you need to consider, in my opinion. But thank you so much for your time today. It's a very long topic I didn't want to go over, but there's a few moments for questions, and if you want to continue the conversation, I'm happy to do so. But this is a funny joke. I tried to find a fun joke. So, yeah, that's it.
Great talk. I think there was just two things I was gonna mention is that, a lot in a 30,000 foot view of this, meaning, being valued as a physician, you can see the rise and fall of different specialties over time, over 35 years. I mean, a perfect example is cardiac surgery. So in the late 80s in Miami, with the contingent of cardiac surgeons that there was, and the need for open cardiac surgery. I mean, these guys and girls, but most of the guys were kings. I mean, literally, Dr. First, I don't know if anybody knows Dr. First, but he would go in a helicopter and he would get positive on the top of Mount Sinai on the beach, and then he would fly over to Mercy Hospital. And they would literally have the chest cracked open for him. And he would walk in, do his bypass, get back onto the helicopter, and go to his next surgery while that patient was waiting for him open. And back in those days, he was making $3 or $4 million a year. Just to imagine what that would mean. And then, it's 30, and the need for cardiac surgery is almost, they're done. Everything is done percutaneous. It's amazing, and obviously the compensation is completely sort of effaced. So, I think as a medical student, when you're looking, and a neurosurgeon, when you're looking at subspecialties, and you've dedicated all of this time training, you really have to take that into account. Like, what am I going to look like in 30 years? Am I going to be a dinosaur, and it's been taken over by another non-invasive field? So I think that's really important. I think the other thing is the migration of nurse practitioners into different subspecialties, which also kind of bases the value. And the last thing is trauma surgery in neurosurgery is a critical negotiating point for our specialty. Something we cannot lose, and it's something that trauma surgeons would love to take over. It's and that you could spend an hour talking about.
Totally.
Any other questions?
Have I wrestled the
Dr.
feathers?
Wang has been very involved in this from a leadership.
No, get involved. And nobody really wants to get involved. I see how hard it is, but it controls billions of dollars. Anybody who's interested, it's a 15-year education. So yeah, very important. It's a great talk.
I was just very regarding the background that's elevated basically that how that influences what
Yeah, I think as of right now, a lot of the payment strategies that are being done are based off of, like we mentioned, there's a little slide in the beginning, but essentially the discussion that here. So for example, all these exact MACRA and all that stuff, those are acts that came about, right? But the things that I wanted to focus on were primarily the actual programs that went behind them, meaning that, for example, the readmission rates and how readmission rates can increase or decrease the amount of money that your hospital can get paid as a lump sum from the get-go. Something like hospital acquired conditions, how those can affect. So these are things that, for example, I think particularly for some of the order sets that we use at ask you to document each of the things that these patients are coming in with. If they have a sacral ulcer, if they have a UTI, and if you diagnose these things in the hospital, there's a theoretical incentive not to do something like that, right? Because you're finding something that your hospital now is going to get dinged for. Obviously, practice first, right? But yeah, interesting concept. Dr. Ivan.
Can you talk a little bit about, I think Mike Line was alluding to this a little bit, that there's this lump sum of work reviews, and so if you ever want more for one procedure, it has to take away from another procedure. Is that Medicare kind of value, the value of dollars that's available, or is that kind of something that Rutgers charges?
It's a good question. I did not come across that in my reading for this, but I would imagine, just speculating that it would be something that the RUC would be responsible for discussing. Is that something that's true, Dr. Wang?
So Medicare sets this process through the Balanced Budget Act. The RUC is run by the AMA. The government lets the AMA, whether you like the AMA or not, do this for the US government. Then all the private insurers copy Medicare, and Brazil copies Medicare, and everybody copies around the world for us. Much more to do. So you can keep adding our views. Anytime you want a new code, they're going to devalue our code. They don't. But it's not the code. What they do is they take the set number of RVUs they think are going to have here, they think they're probably to divide it up. So that calculation, the reason why the dollars per RVUs go down is the number of code billing are going up. It's not that they say we want to reduce it. They say there's only so many $trillion. We've got to divide the $1 trillion by every code that every doctor has submitted the last year, and the projected budget would follow it, right? So as people do more and more procedures, the RVU valuation will drop, even though the set RVU number is the same. The amount of dollars you get for that. Right? That's why we get really less. That's exactly what they want. They want more productivity, same amount of money.
Alrighty.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting to hear.
Thank you, sir.
I'm really glad I'm a basic science guy, but basically that's how you have to deal with things today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Masumi Ghosh. Now, Masumi is a assistant professor in the Department of Neurological Surgery, Miami Project, and she works on spinal cord injury and MS primarily, and looks at the innate immune response. So now we're going to talk about sex. So that should get your attention, but she's going to look at sex-dependent disparities in the innate immune response. This is the response to acute stress or injury. And she and her colleagues are looking at this specifically in the area of neuropathic pain after spinal cord injury, which, as you all know, is a major quality of life issue in people living with different types of neurological problems. So, Masumi, thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Dietrich, for your kind introduction. So the title of my talk today is Sex-Dependent Disparities in the Innate Immune Response After Spinal Cord Injury. And the question is, can it be a game changer for targeting central neuropathic pain? So based on the latest data of facts and figures from the National SCI Statistical Center, there are approximately 299,000 persons who live with SCI in the United States. And there is an annual incidence of 18,000 new SCI cases each year. Most of these arise from vehicle crashes or from falls. And if you look at the gender, males account for approximately 78% new SCI cases. So there are various targets for repairing the injured spinal cord, which includes immunomodulation of various key cellular innate immune system cells like microglia and macrophages to confer neuroprotection, replacement of the lost neural tissue, as well as bridging the injury gap by methods such as cell therapy, inhibiting the astrogliosis and components that inhibit neural regeneration, such as chondroitin, sulfate proteoglycan, and myelin debris, and then supplying various growth factors or cytokines that could stimulate axon growth. Then you can modify the intrinsic ability of neurons to regenerate, promote remyelination repair, as well as stimulate endogenous cell repair. So my area of research interest is neuroprotection and immunomodulation. And microglia and macrophages, they get activated soon after spinal cord injury. So if you look at this image here, you can see that this is a coronal section of the contused spinal cord, and it is stained, immunostained with GFAP, which marks the reactive astrocytes, as well as ED1, which marks the activated macrophages and microglia. And then if you compare, well, this is a magnified image of the same, wherein you can see nice rounded bodies of activated macrophages and microglia. So if you compare that with the section that is stained with hematoxylin and luxulfast blue, you can see clearly that the region that is devoid of the healthy tissue is actually overlapping with the activated microglia and the infiltrating macrophages. So microglia, it gets activated soon after spinal cord injury, within hours, and it remains active throughout the entire course. Of course, there are two peaks. The first peak is around 7 days. This is in terms of rodent models. And within 7 days, it has the primary peak. And then there is a second peak, which is in the chronic phase between 60 and 100 days. So microglia, they are, as soon as there is spinal cord injury, they get activated, they become pro-inflammatory, releasing a plethora of cytotoxic cytokines, reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species, a lot of MFPs, and a lot of other cytotoxic components that results in promoting secondary tissue damage. So microglia, other than being pro-inflammatory, it also exists, activated microglia also exists as in its anti-inflammatory phenotype. So if activated microglia can be classified broadly into two phenotypes. One is the classical activation or the pro-inflammatory phenotype. And like I said, they release pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha, IL-1 beta, chemokines, and ATPs, glutamate, as well as are involved in phagocytosis. Whereas the alternately activated microglia, they are neuroprotective by nature, which means that they produce cytokines that are anti-inflammatory. They produce enzymes or proteins that help in tissue remodeling, such as arginase 1 and mannose receptor. They produce various growth factors like BDNF, VEGF, and they are involved in phagocytosis, which is important for debris clearance. However, this is just a broad classification, and microglia and macrophages both, they actually do not occur as distinct phenotypes. They are a spectrum of phenotypes where it's more of an overlapping phenotype between the pro-inflammatory and the anti-inflammatory states. So of course, this has been a matter of debate, and immune cells, they actually show gender differences in the innate and adaptive immune response. So if you focus on macrophages, there are specific proteins that go up higher in males, whereas some that they are upregulated in females. So for example, expression of TLR4 receptor goes up higher more in males after an injury, whereas the phagocytosis is higher in females. In general, the literature thus far suggests that the microglia from males are more pro-inflammatory, whereas the ones from female have a subdued or are less pro-inflammatory. So gender-based across neurological conditions has been shown that have immune etiologies. For example, in males, there is a high prevalence of stroke, but in females, there is poor stroke recovery. There's higher incidence of Parkinson's disease in males, but in females, there is higher incidence of, say, multiple sclerosis, or there is a poor threshold for tolerance of neuropathic pain. So one of the factors that we have to take into consideration is estrogen. This is a female sex hormone that confers neuroprotection by suppressing the inflammatory potential of microglia. So this is an advantage to the female gender. So what estrogen does is it attenuates TLR4 receptor. It blocks phospho-P38 kinase, an enzyme needed for promoting the inflammatory pathway that is triggered by microglia. It attenuates some of the key transcriptional factors like NF-kappa B that's involved in initiating the inflammatory pathway. And with aging, there is a decline in the level of estrogen, which in turn alters the microglial activity towards a more pro-inflammatory phenotype. And experiments in rodent models have showed that following ovarectomy, the microglia in female rodent models are have a more pro-inflammatory phenotype. So what is the role of estrogen in the manifestation and progression of pathologies that have a clear gender prevalence? The reason this question comes up because the immunomodulatory role of estrogen is an unresolved paradox. For example, multiple sclerosis, stroke, neuropathic pain, all have immunological etiologies. And yet, in spite of the presence of estrogen, there is twofold higher incidence of multiple sclerosis in females. And although the incidence of stroke is higher in male, the outcome or recovery is poor in females. Similarly, in neuropathic pain, there is higher threshold in males and poor tolerance in females. So one of the studies carried out recently, which involves traumatic brain injury in rodent models, showed that there's a difference in the acute behavioral outcome in mice, which was gender dependent. And here, a number of behavioral tests were done, including Rotarod, open field test, and maze test, and each one of them showed that the females did better. They had a better behavioral outcome. And then there was a paper published from here, in Miami project by Dr. Damian Pierce, and he used a huge number of animals as an N in different cohorts and showed that there is improved locomotion and tissue preservation in female rats after spinal cord injury. So I was interested in looking at whether there is a gender difference in microglia and what is the specific phenotype of microglia after spinal cord injury. So the first part is the hypothesis of the study is that activated microglia in females will exhibit an attenuated pro-inflammatory phenotype compared to males after spinal cord injury. So for this study, we used rodent models of both genders, and we induced spinal cord injury. We used spinal cord contusion, which involved a moderate thoracic contusion at the T8 level, followed by looking at the microglial population by either FACS sorting or looking at changes in the phenotype by performing immunochemistry experiments. So the first experiment that we did is we isolated microglia based on specific markers. We isolated the purified population from both males and female rats after inducing spinal cord injury at 7 days post-injury. And here we noticed that male animals actually possessed higher number of spinal microglia after spinal cord injury compared to the female animals. And this was more or less consistent in all the animals we looked at where we used an N of 5 to 6. Next, we wanted to see if there is any difference in the size or morphology among genders. But apparently they look alike, irrespective of microglia coming from male or female in naive or spinal cord injured. Here, the picture is of a naive animal, and you can see there isn't any marked difference between either the size or the morphology of microglia from both genders. So that's well and good. Next, we wanted to see how does the pro-inflammatory and the anti-inflammatory profile looks for microglia that has been isolated from either the naive or the 7-day post-injury spinal cords. And we started looking at two of the main characteristic markers. One is INOS that goes up with the pro-inflammatory state immediately after spinal cord injury. And the other, which is arginase, which normally goes down, although there is a little peak coming up during the acute phase based on the literature. And we see that both in the naive, which are the first top two panels, and in the spinal cord injured animals, the male animals showed a much robust INOS expression in microglial cells compared to the female animals. In the bottom panel, you can see that there's a shift in INOS expression in the male, shown in red, compared to the female when looked by flow cytometry experiments. So this shows the immunostaining of INOS in spinal cord injured tissue, and the top panel shows in green IBA, which stains for both microglia and macrophages when they're activated, and in red shows the INOS, which is, you can see how robustly it is expressed in male compared to in females, and this is the injury epicenter that was stained for the two characteristic markers of IBA1 and INOS, and there is a very remarkable difference between male and female, suggesting that the male microglia from the male animals are much more iNOS positive than that from female animals. Next, we looked at arginase 1. So this is just the reverse of what iNOS does. They are like a seesaw. iNOS goes up, arginase comes down. And here we see that the microglial cells, activated microglial cells in the injury epicenter from females show a robust arginase 1 expression compared to that in the females. But this is only after spinal cord injuries. Surprisingly, the naive animals actually show much more arginase expression. So this says that the microglial cells that are obtained from female animals after subacute spinal cord injury are more anti-inflammatory compared to their male counterparts. We followed by looking at TLR4 expression and in the same tissue. And like you can see, TLR4, which normally goes up immediately after inflammation, it shows increased expression in the male animals, which are in the microglia from male animals, which are in the top panel, compared to that are in the female microglia. Next, we looked at CD86. This is another pro-inflammatory marker that is expressed in a number of immune cells, and they basically they produce signals, co-stimulatory signals to activate other cells like T cells. So here it was a little reverse. The female microglia showed higher expression of CD86 positive marker, which is actually a pro-inflammatory marker compared to the male counterpart. And this was observed both in the naive animals as well as the 7 days post-SCI tissue. Then we looked at CD68 phagocytic markers. So whenever the microglial cells are activated and they become phagocytic, they express a marker called CD68. And here we noticed that the female microglia showed much more CD68 positive population than the male counterpart. I mean, both had CD68 population, but it looks like microglia derived from female animals are more potent in debris clearance. And this was also confirmed by the flow experiment. And you can see a shift in the CD68 positive staining in females shown in the bottom flow graph. But there's another marker, mannose receptor. So this is a marker that is involved in tissue remodeling. And this goes up following spinal cord injury in both genders. We didn't see any difference between the male or the female microglia. So to summarize, female microglia shows a reduced pro but higher anti-inflammatory phenotype after SCI. So in red, you see the pro-inflammatory markers where iNOS, TNF-alpha, TLR4, and CD86 all go up in male, except CD86, which is a pro-inflammatory marker, is higher in female in the subacute post-SCI period. And conversely, arginase 1, CD68, and MRC1, they all go up in female, but it also MRC1 and doesn't show much difference between male and female. So this clearly says that the microglia obtained from female are more anti-inflammatory rather than the males, which have a inherent more pro-inflammatory phenotype. Following this, we wanted to look at some of the signaling pathways, which like kinases that are involved in inflammation, as well as transcription factors such as NF-kappa B, which is a master regulator of inflammation. So when we looked at phospho-P38 MAP kinase, it initiates inflammation by activating NF-kappa B and also downstream increase in TNF-alpha and IL-1 beta. And you can see that there is a robust increase in nuclear phospho-P38 in females. So this was quite contradictory because we normally know that phospho-P38 is involved in inflammation. And so why should it go up in female microglia and somewhat less and remained much low in male microglia? So we did the analysis in the bottom panel, and you can see that there's a statistically significant difference between male and female microglia, but female microglia expresses abundant phospho-P38, and that's localized in the nucleus. So looking into the literature, it turns out that phospho-P38 actually could be promoting the anti-inflammatory phenotype. So I pulled out a bunch of literature. So that was a surprise. And it looks like phospho-P38 actually could be inducing alternate activation of microglia in spinal cord injury based on how it has been studied in other systems. So next we looked at phospho-P65 NF-kappa B. This is a subunit of NF-kappa B that gets activated. It relocates from the cytoplasm to the nucleus and then starts a pathway of generating inflammatory cytokines. So it starts the transcription. And here you can see that on the top panel, you see activated phospho-P65 in the microglia that are derived from male animals. And in the bottom panel, you see phospho-P65 in the female animals, in the microglia of the female animals. And there is a very big difference, not only in the expression level of phospho-P65, but also the localization. So in microglia of the male animals, you see nice nuclear localization, and that's what is expected. Phospho-P65 translocates to the nucleus after activation. But that's not the case in case of female animals. It remains in the cytoplasm, and you see the nice punctate cytoplasmic appearance of phospho-P65. So this was a big difference and could be an underlying mechanism why females show reduced pro-inflammation. So in this image, we see a magnified view where on the top panel, you see microglia, activated microglia that has phospho-P65 in the nucleus of the cells, whereas in the bottom panel, you see cytosolic localization of phospho-P65 in the female microglia. We quantitated this, and there was a clear difference between the localization as well as expression of phospho-P65 in male versus female, where female was, it was restricted to the cytosol. Does it mean that it's still not degraded or still not activated? So basically, this image on the top, this is a little tiny, but phospho-P65, actually NF-kappa B exists as a complex of 3 different subunits. One is phospho-P65, one is I-kappa B, and the third is P50. What happens is that I-kappa B gets degraded, and then phospho-P65 and phospho-P50, they go as a dimer, they enter into the nucleus in its activated state, where phospho-P65 is it's involved in the transcription of the various inflammatory genes, but phospho-P50 could work either way. It could also work as a repressor. So surprisingly, when we looked at the phospho-I-kappa B, which normally gets degraded prior to activation of phospho-P65, you are not supposed to see it at all. But very surprisingly, it showed completely different results. We saw abundant phospho-I-kappa B in the male microglia. We saw nuclear phospho-I-kappa B in female microglia too, but it was significantly less compared to the male microglia. And next we looked at phospho-P50. Now this was completely reversed. So here in female microglia, phospho-P50 is robustly present in the nucleus of the cells. And you can see a marked difference between the male and the female. So does that mean that phospho-P50 is somehow acting as a repressor of the inflammatory pathway?
Does this change over time? There's early shape, and there's females, at least I'm going to
That's a very good question. So no, with female, we did not see a change. It's still in the nucleus. We're still analyzing this data, but in male with chronic time point, there's actually a decrease of phospho-P65, and phospho-P50 didn't look that robust. It looked similar. So it could be that with time in the chronic phase, it's shifting more from the M1 to or rather from a pro-inflammatory to a somewhat subdued pro-inflammatory phase in these immune cells. Yes, I'll come to that. In the lesion center, yes, there is abundant CD68. We haven't teased out the difference between the male and female. We're in the process of doing that, but I'll come to it that come to it with the lumbar cord, it's completely different results. So here is a quantification done for the levels of IKAPA B and phospho-P50. And you can see that in females, there is reduced IKAPA B overall and more in males, but phospho-P50 is much more in female microglia. So to summarize this, phospho-P38 is upregulated in the lesion center post spinal cord injury in female at 7-day time point. Phospho-P65, on the other hand, is upregulated more in male and has a different localization, has a more nuclear localization as expected. Phospho-IKAPA B is higher in male, but phospho-P50 is higher in female. So female microglia exhibit an arginase 1 high, INOS low, TLR4 low, and CD68 high anti-inflammatory phenotype. Conversely, male microglia exhibited a reverse phenotype where arginase is low, INOS expression is much higher, there's increased TLR4 expression, and comparatively lower CD68 expression. After spinal cord injury, phospho-P38 MAP kinase shows sex-dependent differential expression levels and localization after spinal cord injury, whereas the transcription factor NF-kappa B shows a differential expression and subcellular localization with respect to all of its 3 subunits in, and that was sex-dependent, where P65 is more in males and is nuclear localized, whereas P50 is more in females and is similarly nuclear localized. So next, we wanted to find out if we could alter the microglial cell phenotype after spinal cord injury towards a more protective phenotype using pharmacological approaches, which will provide a means of abating tissue injury and neuronal loss. So we did, so in our lab previously, we showed that cyclic AMP, which is a second messenger, is a key regulator of inflammation, and it promotes anti-inflammatory phenotype and converts the microglial phenotype to a more anti-inflammatory state when used in combination with Th2 cytokines like IL-4 or IL-13. So here this cartoon shows that when we treat cells, we first started off doing the in vitro experiments, and then we followed up with in vivo experiments. So in vitro experiments, when we treat microglia with TNF-alpha or LPS, as expected, they become pro-inflammatory with specific markers that, such as INOS, increase in INOS or reactive oxygen species that are characteristics, along with producing IL-1 beta or TNF-alpha. But on the other hand, if we treat activated microglia or naive microglia with a combination of IL-4 and cyclic AMP together, we can actually promote the conversion of the anti-inflammatory phenotype. And here they express arginase 1, YM1, reduced INOS, and reduced phospho-P38 and NF-kappa B. So this was done first in culture using microglia cells, followed with looking into in vivo. So we started off doing a pilot experiment, and we administered IL-4 and dibutyryl cyclic AMP in spinal cord injured animals acutely after injury for a period of 7 days, where it was given intraperitoneally through daily injections. So for this, we used an analog of cyclic AMP, which is a dibutyryl cyclic AMP, just to test the phenomenon. And you can see on the top in A, on the left, it's the injured spinal cord coronal section, which has very few arginase positive cells. But on the right, you can see robust number of microglial cells that express arginase 1. This was following treatment with IL-4 and cyclic AMP, dibutyryl cyclic AMP. So we were actually able to convert microglia or push them towards the anti-inflammatory phenotype. In parallel, when we looked at the tissue, looked at INOS level, we saw that INOS decreased in the microglial cells, which is on the right of the second panel. And you can see that IL-4 and cyclic AMP together are able to convert the cells more towards an anti-inflammatory phenotype with reduced INOS and increased arginase expression. So one problem of using dibutyl cyclic AMP is that it is toxic. The dibutyl moiety of the cyclic AMP, it gets hydrolyzed and monobutyrate is released, which is quite toxic and cannot really be used in vivo. It's not really clinically amenable. So we were looking for other compounds that could be used in place of cyclic AMP, and we found that propantophylline, which is a xanthine derivative and has properties of a phosphodiesterase inhibitor is able to prevent adenosine reuptake inhibitor, could be used in place of dibutyl cyclic AMP. Another advantage of propantophylline or PPF is that it can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it has already been demonstrated that it can confer anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective activity in vivo. So we tried to compare, again, in another pilot study, we compared dibutyl cyclic AMP and PPF together. So on the top left panel, this was done first in vitro, and we saw that using propantophylline instead of dibutyl cyclic AMP produced or pushed the expression of arginase in the cells, which indicates in microglial cells when it's activated with TNF-alpha or LPS, which indicates that propantophylline in combination with IL-4 can actually promote the anti-inflammatory or neuroprotective phenotype. On the right panel in the graph, you can see when the same was used in culture, we could actually see a decrease in phospho-P38, which is normally considered as a signaling kinase that promotes the pro-inflammatory pathway, and as well as it can reduce phospho-P65 activation. So next, when we did the in vivo experiment, so the extreme left panel shows the control SCI control animals, and the center shows when treated with SCI animals were treated with a daily dose injection of dibutyl cyclic AMP in combination with IL-4 given systemically through IP injections for a period of 7 days. And then the third panel shows the same, except that dibutyl cyclic AMP is now replaced with propantophylline. So we do not see any changes in the microglial population present in the tissue, whether it's in the spinal cord injured tissue, whether it's treated with IL-4 in combination with dibutyl cyclic AMP or PPF, which is good because you do not want the tissue to be devoid of microglia. It's actually needed for neuroprotection in spite of its inflammatory potential in the earlier phase. So next we looked at arginase, and you can see that in the control tissue, there is less arginase expression in the microglial cells, whereas in the bottommost panel, you can see that there is increased arginase expression in the microglial population. And this happens for both dibutyl cyclic AMP and PPF used in combination with IL-4. We also saw a decrease in K. You can see there is a decrease in TNF-alpha with presence of TNF-alpha in the animals, in the cohort of animals that received dibutyl cyclic AMP, and the same was observed when PPF was used instead. Whereas in M, you can see that there is a reduction in phospho-P38 levels in the DB camp or in PPF administered animals compared to the control. So clearly we could use propantophylline as an alternative, which is safe in place of dibutyl cyclic AMP in combination with Th2 cytokines to promote or drive this anti-inflammatory or neuroprotective phenotype of microglia. We also looked in the lumbar cord, and we stained for GABA, and we saw that in the bottom two panels, there was presence of GABA, which was encouraging the GABAergic neurons. They are inhibitory to pain in the lumbar cord, and is essential post-spinal cord injury. Whereas when we looked for phospho-P38, we could see a clear reduction in the level of phospho-P38 in these animals that are injected with PPF plus IL-4. So in the middle panel, you have dibutyl cyclic AMP and IL-4, and the bottom panel has PPF and IL-4. And you can see clear overlap between microglia and see microglia stained with IBA1 and phospho-P38, which is the inflammation driving kinase. So the question is, will modulation of activated microglial phenotype to an anti-inflammatory state alter behavioral outcome after spinal cord injury, such as locomotion and central neuropathic pain? So activated microglia, they play a pro-nociceptive role by mediating hyperexcitability of spinal dorsal horn neurons and induce transmission of pain. Most of the work that has characterized this has involves peripheral nerve injury. So microglia, when they are activated, there's an upregulation of phospho-P38 and ERK. There's an upregulation of the transcription factor NF-kappa B, and this results in producing TNF-alpha pro-inflammatory signals like TNF-alpha and IL-1 beta, generation of reactive oxygen species, and of course BDNF, which altogether they bind to various receptors such as NMDA receptors or AMPA receptors, and this results in transmission of pain signal through the dorsal horn neurons, which are the first relay in transmitting pain to the central nervous system. At the same time, it is also involved in inhibiting or repressing some of the inhibiting signals that are produced by glycine or GABA receptors. So the hypothesis is phenotypic conversion of pro-inflammatory microglia and macrophages to an anti-inflammatory form using selective combinations of immunomodulators will promote repair and block the development and persistence of central neuropathic pain after spinal cord injury. So for this study, we used both male and female animals. We used rodent models, Fisher rats, and we induced spinal cord moderate spinal cord condition at the T8 level. Following induction of spinal cord injury, we either administered the vehicle, which is just PB, phosphate buffer, or we administered IL-4 and PPF together, given daily through IP injection for a period of 15 days. And this was followed by sensory evaluation to assess pain outcome after the endpoint, which was a 2-month or 8-week period. First, we looked at motor function recovery. We looked at gross locomotor function. And like you can see, the cohort that received both IL-4 and PPF, both in males and females, showed improved locomotion. This was significantly improved and at a moderate stage where basically there was restoration in the intervals of uncoordinating steppings at 8 weeks post injury. There wasn't much difference between male and female when it comes to locomotion, but we did see that PPF and IL-4 together did improve motor function after at the end point. Next, we looked at sensory functions after contusive SCI at 8 weeks post-injury. So here, assessment of cutaneous allodynia was determined based on foot withdrawal in response to normally innocuous mechanical stimuli. Here we were looking at withdrawal of the foot following application of pressure. And on the left panel, you see male animals, and on the right panel, you see the female animals. And there is a clear improvement in the sensory function in the male animals. In female, we saw a slight increase, but it wasn't significant. So following this, we looked at thermal hyperalgesia, where assessment of thermal hyperalgesia was performed based on evaluating the threshold or time of hind paw withdrawal from a normally innocuous heat source using the Hargreaves heat source. And again, similar to the improvement in cutaneous allodynia, we saw that only the male animals actually responded to PPF IL-4, and female animals didn't show any significant increase or improvement in pain outcome. So the threshold was much better with the male animals only when the combination was used, but not when either of the agents were administered independently. So now we wanted to correlate the histology with the behavioral outcome that we observed in case of central neuropathic pain. So the first thing we looked at is we wanted to see the level of activation of microglia and macrophages, infiltrating macrophages in the dorsal horn lamina 1 and 2, and see how they look like which is the microglia when they get activated. A common marker that is used is CD68 or ED1, and that's a marker of phagocytosis. So on the extreme left panel, which says A, is actually the region that is from the dorsal horn lamina, whereas B is the region from the lateral white matter region. And you can see, very surprisingly, microglia and also maybe infiltrating macrophages, they retain a very ramified morphology. Normally, when they are activated, they have shorter processes and bigger cell body, but they retain a ramified morphology in the dorsal horn, and they do not express CD68. So this was surprising. That means that these cells are not phagocytic at all. Whereas in contrast, a region very close to in the white matter region where we can clearly see that all the microglia, they have a different morphology. Typically what is expected out of an activated cell, they're very rounded and they have very high expression of the phagocytic marker CD68. So this is one big difference we saw that doesn't occur after peripheral nerve injury, and we actually see it in the central nervous system injury, in spinal cord injury. That's correct. These are 8 weeks post, previously at 7 days. Yes.
I think we understand what's happening. Usually, a lot of studies find what response to acute injury, the stroke, and the TBI response, and injury, but that response appears to be sometimes not correlated with long-term outcomes. So I think that's I think asked earlier.
Yes. Yes.
What's happening? First slide showing something happening chronically. Which the animals have been assessed for neuropathic pain?
Yes, they have been assessed for neuropathic pain and they show pain. So, but this is there was no difference between gender, but there was difference between the location of how active or how phagocytic these cells were in the chronic stage. So since our initial goal was to promote or drive the activated microglia to an arginase positive anti-inflammatory phenotype by administering PPF and IL-4, we looked at the presence of arginase in microglial cells. And this was again a strange result we noticed, that we did not see any arginase positive cells and microglial cells in either or in the dorsal lumbar cord, in the dorsal lamina 1 and 2, we did not see any microglia that are actually arginase positive, irrespective of the gender. So if you see any red staining on the other side, it's probably in the blood vessels maybe, but nothing that stands out that overlaps with the green IBA positive, IBA1 positive microglial cells. So there could be several reasons. One, maybe the arginase 1 tapered down because it's a chronic phase, not an acute or a subacute phase. And two, the treatment was given only for 15 days. So when the treatment is withdrawn, there is a possibility that the cells are reverting back to a phenotype that is not as anti-inflammatory.
Also, it's provided once and both macrophage and microglia.
That's correct.
So
Yes.
still have vascularity.
Yes. Always infiltrating.
And so, so better markers.
Yes. Yes, I agree with you. We probably have to do flow cytometry to do that. In immunostaining, we tried out certain markers like Cyclic and TMEM, but they don't work very well in the rat model. In mice, we could see some, but doing immunochemistry is like tricky using this. But flow cytometry will be definitely an approach to go for. So then we wanted to look at the levels of phospho-P38 MAP kinase in the lumbar dorsal horn. And here, again, in green, you have the IBA1 positive cells, and the phospho-P38 is marked with, shown in red. So there was an overall increase in phospho-P38 level in the males compared to the females. Now, this is not just in the IBA1 cells. You can see a lot of phospho-P38 even in the neurons. So, but when we did the overall change we wanted to do, we did an analysis, and there was increased phospho-P38 in the males compared to the females. So this was quite reverse to the subacute time point that that I showed before, where you see phospho-P38 expressed at a much higher level in the female lesion center subacutely. But here in the lumbar cord in the chronic stage, you see overall a reduction in phospho-P38 activation in the female lumbar cord post-injury at 2 months period. So this is comparing the different treatment cohorts, and on the top 2 panels show male and the bottom 2 panels show the female animals. In red, it is phospho-P38. In green, it is microglia macrophages. So the control, SCI control, is the extreme left panel, and you can see that again there is more phospho-P38 in the males, somewhat less in the female. And then when the treatment was carried out, the male showed decrease when there is in phospho-P38 levels when IL-4 was given or when PPF was given. But when it was combined treatment of IL-4 and PPF, there was a robust decrease in phospho-P38 levels. In females, there was not much significant changes in the level of phospho-P38. Now, again, the phospho-P38 here is present both in the dorsal horn neurons as well as in the microglia. It's a global reduction in male following treatment with the combined IL-4 and PPF. Whereas in female, there is some decrease, but it wasn't significant. So now in this slide, we see a more close-up of the microglial cells that express phospho-P38. So the SCI control, you can see the green microglial cells showing the red stained center, which is phospho-P38. There's also again phospho-P38 in other cells. The neurons express it. SCI controls that were treated with IL-4 or PPF also showed a reduction as expected. So these are all male animals, again at the chronic stage. And combined IL-4 and PPF showed the maximal reduction in the levels of phospho-P38 within the microglia from the dorsal horn region. So we performed a correlation between the behavioral outcome that we observed in the male animals and that we saw in the female animals. We took all the animals and we took measured the immunoreactivity of phospho-P38. And we saw that there is a clear difference between a male and female, where the central neuropathic pain threshold was much higher when there was reduced phospho-P38 immunoreactivity in the males. Whereas as the immunoreactivity of phospho-P38 increases, be it microglia or in the dorsal horn neurons, we see there is reduction in the threshold, but this is only restricted to the male. In the female animals, we didn't see any correlation with the behavioral outcome and phospho-P38 levels. So to summarize, cyclic AMP is a key regulator of anti-inflammatory phenotype that can convert microglia to the anti-inflammatory phenotype, and propentifilin mimics cyclic AMP, or rather dibutyryl cyclic AMP, to promote neuroprotection when administered systemically in combination with IL-4 in the acute and subacute stage. Acute systemic administration of PPF combined with IL-4 significantly ameliorates SCI-associated central neuropathic pain in males, and improved sensory outcome following treatment with IL-4 and PPF correlates with decreased microglial phospho-P38 MAP kinase expression or activation in the dorsal horn of the lumbar cord following SCI in males only. So based on the results that we have, our future directions are to confirm gender-dependent role of phospho-P38 MAP kinase inducing central neuropathic pain by employing P38 conditional knockout animals of both genders. And then if it is actually restricted, this phospho-P38 has a role only in male animals, then to identify the specific cellular targets associated with CNP in females. So it's based on some experiments done in peripheral nerve injury in other labs, it has been shown that T cells may be involved in playing a role in triggering pain after peripheral nerve injury. We don't know what it could be with spinal cord injury. And then, of course, to do a proteomic analysis to characterize the exact microglial phenotype that is associated with spinal cord injury mediated chronic neuropathic pain. We also want to delineate the mechanism underlying sex-dependent differential NF-kappa-B signaling or P65 signaling in activated immune cells and after subacute SCI. And of course, optimize the therapeutic route and window for administering PPF and IL-4 for targeting chronic neuropathic pain. With this, I conclude the talk, but I would like to acknowledge Jinyang Lee, who did most of the flow cytometry work in the lab. Ashley, Keely, they worked on immunohistochemistry. Andrew and Thomas, they worked on immunohistochemistry. I would like to thank our collaborators, Dr. Damian Pierce, Dr. Jackie Sagan, and Dr. Stanis Zarkova, without whose help this would not have been possible. This study would not have been possible. I'd like to thank the Animal Corps, Dr. Macio, Miguel, and Ramon for help with acquisition of behavioral data. I would like to thank Yanshi from the Image Analysis Core and Patricia from the Flow Cytometry Core. Also would like to thank funding, which is the most important to carry out any study, of course. And for that, I would like to thank the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis, the Bono County Fund, and the VA for funding the study. Thank you, and I welcome questions for more. Yes,
It's great work, by the way, very interesting.
thank you.
You mentioned at the beginning about estrogen, you're taking female rats. Do you think that this is something that's primarily hormonal, it's genetic? What do you think is actually driving this change? It's something modifiable, right?
Yes, yes. So yeah, we did not over-optimize the animals. They were taken from the, they were not taken from the estrous cycle, so they were out of that. So we don't see any influence from that, but they were not over-optimized. That's something that should be done to again further confirm. Yeah. But estrogen could have a role, yes.
10 years ago. Recognized the animal. And male females responded to the same. There is attack over this female protected. So that's it certainly had a huge response. Certainly, I would expect that's the slow.
Thank you so much.
As I said earlier, if something happens, as all these inflammatory response cool down, maybe the narrative response will take over. I think that the gender is there too.
Yes, yes.
What I was going to say is that it's pretty nice talk. We talk about gender and sex, talk about immune severity, and now we're talking a lot about age. Yeah, all
Very much, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
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 You got 3 peaks of injury now. You've got a very early peak.
Yes.
Middle peak, 45, and you have over 60.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes.
You just wonder, how that's going to affect the physiology and brain injury and stroke. So
Yes, yes.
I would now start utilizing these two techniques. Continue down this road, that's great. But I start looking for age.
That's very good suggestion, yes.
That's because I'm really excited about population.
Yes, and that's also the estrogen goes down with age. So that's another,
Correct.
so it'll be more prone. So that'll also be, yes, of course, that's a great suggestion.
Jackie, Danny?
Yes. Yes. Yes, the starting point is. Yeah. Yes, yes. So we did probe for iNOS in the chronic animals. surprisingly, we didn't see any INOS in the dorsal horn microglia at all. Neither we saw arginase, which was, just completely a big surprise because we thought, okay, we don't see arginase because of reasons such as, withdrawal of treatment after 15 days and so on, but we didn't see any INOS either. So it looks like it's the arginase INOS is that balance that we see in the subacute stage is actually not, it doesn't have much of a role in the chronic stage. And I think something else like phospho-P38 could be quite critical in deciding which way to go. So.
Reducible costs, there's the other thing, they are, takes several days for the icons to actually reduce. And you're showing for 7 days.
7 days. Yeah.
So in other studies, and that would be kind of interesting, the gender difference in terms of connected high cost induction in terms of the LP. Never seen that solution, so kind of nice model for this.
Yeah.
I mean, you do single cell sequencing.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yes. It's not very specific. Yeah, it is very restricted. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, definitely transcriptomics. And actually a study was recently conducted by Jensel's group, and he did some gene expression work. He showed that
Spoke after me in London, and basically he focused all on age.
yes, age and sex. So I'm showing only this gender difference here. This is from his publication last year. So here he has shown similar results where, things like arginase and MRC1, which are considered as anti-inflammatory, is actually lower. In blue, it's the lower in range, and whereas in males, whereas in females, it's actually higher. So he's showing anything in that's less expressed. Whereas, something like TNF alpha doesn't show much of a change, but then he's using a mice model where we have used rat. So there could be some differences there because we see robust changes in rat TNF levels. So. It could be an emotional factor or less, yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thanks.